Accumulators. As noted, one of the primary demands of this work is sincerity. However, there are of course different kinds of sincerity. There is clever sincerity and there is stupid sincerity, just as there is clever insincerity and stupid insincerity. Both stupid sincerity and stupid insincerity are equally mechanical. However, if one wishes to learn to be cleverly sincere, then they must first be sincere with their teacher, and then with others that are sincere to them in the work. This can then be considered clever sincerity. It is important to note, however, that sincerity must not become a lack of considering. Lack of considering with regard to the teacher or with regard to those whom the teacher has appointed destroys all possibility of work. If they wish to learn to be cleverly sincere, then a person must be sincere about the work, and they must learn to be silent when it is prudent to be silent. With those outside of the work who can neither understand nor appreciate it. Sincerity in the group is an essential prerequisite, because if one continues to lie to the group in the same way that they lie to themselves, and to others in life, then they will never learn to distinguish the truth from a lie. The second barrier is then the conquest of fear. A person often has many unnecessary fears. Lies and fears are the atmosphere in which an ordinary individual lives. Therefore, just as the conquest of lying is individual, then so too is the conquest of fear. Everyone has fears of their own that are peculiar to them alone. We are all of us individuals and not clones, so these fears must first be identified and then destroyed. Fears referred to are usually associated with the lies among which a person lives. This has nothing in common though with the fear of spiders or snakes, of dark rooms or unaccountable nervous phobias. The struggle against lying in oneself and the struggle against fears are the first work that one begins with. We must also realize that positive effort, even sacrifice in the work, do not justify or excuse mistakes that may follow. On the contrary, things that could be forgiven of someone who has made no effort and sacrificed nothing will not be forgiven in another who has already made great sacrifices. This appears to be unjust, however, one must understand the law. There is, as it were, a separate account kept for every person. Their effort and sacrifice are written down on one side of the ledger, and their mistakes and misdeeds on the other. What is written down on the positive side can never atone for what is written down on the negative side. What is recorded on the negative side can only be wiped out by the truth, namely an instant and complete confession to oneself, to others, and above all to the teacher. If a person sees their faults but continues to justify themselves, then a small offense may destroy the result of years of work and effort. Therefore, it is often better to admit one's guilt, even when one is not guilty. This, however, is a thin line and must not be exaggerated. Otherwise, the result will again be lying, and what is worse still, lying prompted by fear. It is not possible, therefore, to begin the work as soon as a group is formed, as a group is a major progression. A group is begun for definite concerted work, and for a definite aim. The teacher has to trust the group, and they in turn have to trust the teacher and one another in order for anything to be possible, and only then can it become a group. Until there is general work progressing, it can only ever be a preparatory group and nothing more. Preparation is required over the course of time, which is possible only by imitating a group such as it ought to be, imitating it inwardly of course and not outwardly. Why is this necessary? Firstly, one must understand that all members of a group are responsible for one another. A mistake on the part of one is considered a mistake on the part of all. This is a law, and this law is well founded, for as will be seen, what one acquires is acquired by all. The rule of common or collective responsibility must be borne in mind. It, however, has another aspect as well. Members of a group are responsible not only for the mistakes of others, but also for their failures. The success of one is the success of all, and the failure of one is the failure of all. A grave mistake on the part of one, such as for example the breaking of a fundamental rule, inevitably leads to the dissolution of an entire group. The group must work as one machine, the parts of the machine must know one another, and help one another. In a group there can be no personal interests opposed to the interests of others, or opposed to the interests of the work. There can be no personal sympathies or antipathies that hinder the work. All the members of the group are friends and peers, but if one of them leaves, and particularly if they are sent away by the teacher, then they cease to be a friend or a colleague and instantly become a stranger, as in one who is cut off or exiled from the tribe. This often becomes a very difficult rule, but is nevertheless necessary. People can be lifelong friends and enter into a group together. Afterward, one of them leaves, which means that the other has no right to speak to them about the work of the group. The departed therefore feels hurt but does not understand this, which means they may quarrel. In order to avoid dispute, where relations such as spouse, parent or offspring and so on are concerned, they are counted as one unit. For example, a couple are counted as one member of the group. Thus, if one of them cannot continue with the work and leaves, then the other is considered invested and so must also leave. We can be helped only to the extent that we are willing to help, and in the beginning our help will be reckoned not by actual results, which are almost certain to be minimal, but by the magnitude and force of our effort. What is said must not be taken too formally, however, as there is no particular benefit in the existence of groups in and of themselves, and there is no merit to be gained by belonging to groups. Their results and nothing else determine the benefit or usefulness of groups. The work of every individual can proceed in three directions. They can be useful to the work, they can be useful to the teacher, and they can be useful to themselves. It is of course desirable that one's work should produce results in all three directions, however failing this one can be reconciled to two. For example, if a person is useful to the teacher, by this very fact they are also useful to the work. Or if they are useful to the work, then they are useful also to the teacher. However, if for example, one is useful to the work and useful to the teacher, but unable to be useful to themselves, then this is wrong because it is not sustainable and so will not last. If a person takes nothing for themselves and does not change, if they remain such as they were before, then the fact of their having by chance been useful for a short time is not to their credit. What happens most often is that their usefulness does not last for very long. The work grows and changes, but if a person does not grow and change themselves, then they cannot keep up with the work. The work leaves them behind, and the very thing that was once useful may begin to become harmful. In the conduct of the work, ordinary effort does not count, only supreme effort counts, and so it is always and in everything. Those that do not wish to make supreme effort should give up everything and instead take care of their health. Supreme effort can of course be dangerous, however it is better to die making effort to awaken rather than to live in sleep. Note though that it is not so easy to die from effort, as we have much more strength than we think, but rarely or never make use of it. In understanding this one aspect of the human machine needs to be understood. A certain type of accumulator plays a very important role in the human mechanism. There are two small accumulators close to each of our centers, filled with the particular substance necessary for the work of that given center. In addition, there is within the organism a large accumulator that feeds the smaller ones. The small accumulators are connected together, and each of them is connected with the center next to which it stands, as well as with the larger accumulator. Accumulators work in the following way. Let's assume that a person is working, or they are reading a difficult book and so trying to understand it, in which case several roles revolve in the thinking apparatus of their intellect. Or let us suppose they are walking up a hill and growing weary, in which case the roles evolve instead in the moving center. In the first example, the intellectual center, and in the second example, the moving center draw the energy necessary for their work from the small accumulators. When an accumulator is nearly empty, then a person grows tired and would like to stop, so sits down if they are walking, or thinks of something else if they are solving a difficult problem. However, quite unexpectedly they feel an infusion of strength, and are once more able to walk or to work. We often refer to this as a second wind. This means that the center has become connected with the second accumulator, and is taking energy from it. Meanwhile, the first accumulator is refilling with energy from the large accumulator. The work of the center goes on, and the person continues to walk or to work. Sometimes a short rest is required to ensure this connection, sometimes a shock, and sometimes a conscious effort, but at any rate the work continues. However, after a period of time the store of energy in that second accumulator also becomes exhausted, and the person once again grows weary. Again an external shock, a short rest, a refreshment or a conscious effort is required, and they are once again connected with the first accumulator. However, it can happen that the center has depleted energy from the second accumulator so rapidly that the first one has had insufficient time to refill itself from the larger accumulator, and has taken only half of the energy that it can hold, therefore is only half refilled. Having become reconnected with the first accumulator, the center then begins to draw energy from it, while now the second accumulator becomes connected with and draws energy from the large accumulator. However, this time the first accumulator was only half filled, and so the center quickly exhausts its energy. In the meantime, the second accumulator has succeeded in getting only a quarter of its requirements from the large accumulator. The center becomes connected with it, swiftly drawing all of that energy, and so on. After a certain time the organism is brought to such a state that neither of the small accumulators has a drop of energy left, and this time the person feels really exhausted. They almost fall down, almost fall asleep on their feet, or else their organism becomes affected. They develop a headache, palpitations, maybe even feel nauseated. Then suddenly again a short rest, an external shock, a conscious effort brings a new flow of energy, and the person is once more able to think, to walk and to work. This means that the center has become connected directly to the large accumulator. The large accumulator contains an enormous amount of energy, and connected with the large accumulator, a person is literally able to perform miracles, complete a triathlon, or compose a symphony. However, if the roles continue and energy that is made from air, food and impressions continues to pour out of the large accumulator faster than it pours in, then there comes a moment when the large accumulator is drained of all energy. This then means that the organism collapses and dies. This obviously happens seldom, and usually the organism automatically stops working. Special conditions are necessary in order to cause the organism to die, exhausted of all its energy. In ordinary conditions, a person will fall asleep, they will pass out, or simply develop some internal complication that stops the work, a long time before any real danger level is reached. One need not therefore be afraid of effort. The danger of dying from this is not imminent, and it is far easier instead to die from inaction, from laziness, stress, or the fear of making any effort. Our aim is therefore to connect the necessary center with the large accumulator. For as long as we are unable to do this, then all of our work will be wasted, because we shall fall asleep before the expenditure of effort can achieve any kind of result. Small accumulators suffice for the ordinary everyday work of life. However, for work on oneself, for inner growth, and for the efforts that are required of one who enters the way, the energy from these small accumulators is insufficient. We must learn therefore how to draw energy straight from the large accumulator, just as a well-trained athlete learns to draw upon their second wind and burn through any exhaustion. This is possible only with the help of emotional center. It is essential that this be understood, because the desired connection with the large accumulator can be effected only through our emotional center. The instinctive, the moving and intellectual centers by themselves feed only on small accumulators. This is what people need to understand, and their aim must therefore be the development of activity in the emotional center. The emotional center is an apparatus much more subtle than the intellectual center, particularly if we take into consideration the fact that in the whole of the intellectual center, the only part that works is the formatory apparatus, that many things are quite inaccessible to our intellectual center. If anyone desires to know and to understand more than they actually know and understand, then they must remember that new knowledge and new understanding will come only through the emotional center, and not through the intellectual center. We have to feel. There are two side notes, or anecdotal functions of our organism that require explanation from the scientific point of view, although science does not of course admit this. These are yawning and laughter. Neither one of which can be rightly understood without knowing about accumulators and their role in the organism. Notice that we yawn only when we are tired. This is particularly noticeable, for instance, in the mountains, when a person who is unaccustomed to them yawns almost continually whilst ascending a slope. Yawning is the pumping of energy into our small accumulators, in this case oxygenation. When they empty too quickly, when one of them has no time to refill while the other is being emptied, then yawning becomes almost continuous. There are certain physical conditions that can cause stoppages of the heart when a person wishes to but is unable to yawn. Other conditions are also known where something goes wrong with the pump, causing it to work without effect, when a man yawns the whole time but does not pump in any energy. The study of yawning from this perspective could reveal much that is interesting. When activated by dopamine, excitatory amino acids and oxytocin itself, our neurons facilitate yawning by releasing oxytocin at sites distant from the paraventricular nucleus, i.e. the hippocampus, the pons and the medulla oblongata. Laughter is also directly connected with accumulators, however laughing has the opposite effect of yawning. It is not pumping in but drawing out, that is the pumping out and discharge of superfluous energy collected in the accumulators. Ever notice how we giggle when nervous? Sometimes can't stop giggling and our stomach muscles flutter uncontrollably. Laughter does not exist in all centers, but only in centers divided into two halves, positive and negative. Later this will be examined more fully, however for the moment we will look at the intellectual center only. There can be impressions that fall immediately upon the two halves of the center and produce at once a sharp yes or a sharp no reaction. Such a simultaneous yes and no response produces a kind of convulsion in the center, and being unable to harmonize and digest these two opposing impressions of one fact, the center begins to throw out, in the form of laughter, that energy that flows into it from the accumulator whose turn it is to supply resources. In another instance, the accumulator may collect surplus energy that the center cannot manage to utilize. Then, every and even the most ordinary impression can be received as double, which means it can fall at once upon the two halves of the center, and produce laughter, the discarding or discharge of energy. It's what makes us sometimes laugh at tragedy, even though it's not at all funny. Both yawning and laughter are very contagious, which shows that they are essentially functions of the instinctive and the movement centers. Laughter is pleasant because it relieves us of superfluous energy, which if it remained unused may become negative and poison our system. We always have plenty of this poison in us, and this is why we're often told that laughter is the natural antidote. However, this antidote is necessary only for as long as we are unable to use all the energy for useful work. It is said of Christ that he never laughed, and indeed you will find in the Gospels no indication or mention of the fact that at any time Jesus laughed. However, there are different ways of not laughing. There are people who do not laugh because they are completely immersed in negative emotions, in malice, in fear, in hatred and the suspicion of paranoid schizophrenia. Then there are others who do not laugh because they cannot have negative emotions. In the highest centers there can be no laughter, because in higher centers there is no division, no positive or negative, and no yes or no.